For generations, people in America and on the island of Cuba have been waiting for a sign that relations would change between the two countries. We might have just reached that point today. The policy's been set for many years, not allowing gay men to donate blood for fear of infection and disease transfer. But that is coming to an end. Many say it's high time. And looking back 70 years to see where American military strategy changed forever and where the actions of a relative few saved the world from the hands of a murderer. Real stories, real issues, and real facts. In 3 minutes, Midpoint is next.
Hello, I'm John Bachman. Let's get started. A live news conference happening right now with Alan Gross, who was just released today from Cuba after being in prison for 5 years. You can hear him, or see him speaking rather. Gross is just a part of a much bigger story here. We'll bring you Gross's comments coming up here very shortly. You know, another bold stroke of executive power by President Obama, pushing ahead here and a seismic shift potentially in U.S.-Cuban relations by normalizing diplomatic ties between the two countries.
Through these changes, we intend to create more opportunities for the American and Cuban people and begin a new chapter among the nations of the Americas.
Well, here are some of the details of the plan announced today. It would include setting up an embassy in Havana to restore those diplomatic ties, also ease travel restrictions, allowing visitors to import goods from Cuba to the U.S. The new plan also increases the level of money Cuban Americans can send back to that country. However, the president is not allowed to end the embargo without congressional approval, and several members of Congress are blasting the president's plan, especially the deal to release 3 Cuban spies. Florida Senator Marco Rubio says the U.S. should not have negotiated this deal with Cuba.
The 3 spies that were in U.S. custody were not benign spies that were going around cutting out newspaper clippings. At least 2 of them were involved in direct information given to the Cuban government that led to the murder of American citizens.
Well, in exchange for those spies, Cuba released 65-year-old American Alan Gross, who we just saw speaking a few moments ago, and a CIA agent in prison for more than 20 years. The Obama administration also gave Cuba an additional list containing the names of 53 political prisoners they would like to see released. And Pope Francis getting credit for an assist on the U.S.-Cuba deal from President Obama and Raul Castro. Both thanked the Holy Father for his role in this. The Pope reportedly wrote a very personal letter to both Castro and Obama over the summer, encouraging them to, quote, end their frosty relationship. And flu season could be peaking earlier than normal this year, especially in Ohio. State officials there, health officials, say about 400 people are in hospitals around the state with the flu, 4 times more than normally happening this time of year. Things have gotten so bad that some schools in Toledo and Cleveland had to close for a couple of days because they could not find enough substitute teachers. And President Obama may be very popular as a search element on Google, but not so much for Hillary Clinton. According to the top U.S. Google searches for 2014, the former Secretary of State and possible 2016 presidential candidate does not even make the list. President Obama was number 1, followed by New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. Then Kentucky Senator Rand Paul comes in 3rd place. Of course, we'll have much more coming up for you. We'll have a statement from Alan Gross, hopefully, in the next Newsmax Now update. Of course, you can stay tuned to Newsmax TV and Newsmax.com for more on the developing situation with the U.S. and Cuba. Ed Berliner returns next with more from MidPoint.
October 19, 1960, almost 2 years after the Bautista regime was disposed with the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro, the U.S. slapped a crushing embargo on that nation. 2 years later, that ban was extended. And since that date, generations of families have been waiting for a change on their homeland. That change might be here. I'm Ed Berliner, where history may indeed be in the making. This is MidPoint.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our 2 countries.
The release of a political prisoner held in Cuba since 2009, a backdoor swap of spies. Suddenly, relations between America and Cuba have historically changed. And now we discover what it means not only to have these 2 nations together, but what it can mean to a stabilization of world issues. Or perhaps someone's using the American government to their means. Welcome to MidPoint. He is a noted radio and television host in Miami, Florida, once serving as the point man for President Ronald Reagan in dealing with Fidel Castro, and a Newsmax International Advisory Board member, Carlos Perez. Carlos, thank you so much for being here today.
No, it's a pleasure.
Carlos, how do you see this? The president says it's a 50-year embargo that hasn't worked. Others say, wait a minute, we're getting in bed with killers. Where do you stand?
Exactly. We're getting in bed with a Stalinist regime, a communist regime that right now at this particular time, due to the situation of the fall in oil prices in Venezuela and Russia, especially in Venezuela, is desperately trying to get money, trying to get assets, And this is the worst moment, the worst time to negotiate, because the Cuban regime doesn't know what to do. The Cuban regime is actually living out of exile of the money that we send from here, the families, And they want to increase because what Venezuela is doing to Cuba is helping to survive. But Venezuela is on the verge of bankruptcy. And this is the worst moment for the President Obama to negotiate. It should have waited, because you don't negotiate with a communist regime and a Stalinist regime in this particular situation. What do we get out of this negotiation? Liberation of Alan Gross? Alan Gross was not a spy. We liberate 3 spies to Cuba and establish diplomatic relations, which has a symbolic, tremendous propaganda for Castro. This is the worst, in my humble opinion. I am trying to be as objective as possible. The worst negotiation that any president of the United States has made in the history of this country. This is not a negotiation.
Let me pick up on that then.
In some way, somehow, helping the Cuban government, the Cuban communist regime, to stabilize in power. At the moment,
Carlos, let me pick up on that, because let me use a boxing analogy here. Is
Sure.
it possible then that what you're saying is that America had the Cuban government on the ropes, and had they waited a little bit longer, had they waited them out, that things would eventually have collapsed? And I'm going to temper that by saying, haven't we heard that argument for a long time, and that hasn't happened?
No, it's not a long time, but we have to be objective, and we have to see what is Cuba depending on Venezuela. How many thousands of oil is Cuba, receiving from Venezuela? And what happens if Venezuela collapses? And Venezuela is in a state where it will collapse at any moment. In as much as Russia, the price of oil is literally placing these 2 countries in such a situation that really, I don't understand why the president couldn't wait 2 or 3 more months in this negotiation.
But isn't it fair to say, and again, we're going to take a break, come back and talk some more, but about a minute that I have left here. Carlos, is it not fair to say, though, that this embargo has been there for 50 years, and there are critics, such as Marco Rubio and others, who say that, wait a minute, this hasn't worked in 50 years. Nothing's happened. We needed to get rid of it, and we needed to move forward.
Okay.
No, please answer me that. I got about 30 seconds. Please answer that, and then we'll take a break.
You're right. I am not against the lifting the embargo in some way, somehow. But in order to do that, you have to receive something, and this is the something that I don't see in this negotiation. This is a negotiation of one-sided negotiation. This is nothing but, in some way, somehow, believe me, this is not the right thing for the American people or for the Cuban people.
All right, now, if you would please, now I'm going to ask you to hold on for just a couple minutes here. We're going to take a break because I got a bunch more questions that we have to ask on this.
Sure, no question.
So hang tight. We're going to break. We'll return with Carlos Perez. We're going to dig into this new relationship between Cuba and America and see what it means for that part of the world, and perhaps even extending to Russia. But then again, we come up with the fact that already Marco Rubio has said that he will fight this. It's a bad idea. Jeb Bush, who just recently said he would consider the possibility and look into running for president, he has said it's a bad idea. So now you have Congress who's going to be involved in this. Will this even happen? And what is the president's end game? Some say it's just to help the people of Cuba. We got a lot to talk about here. Stick around. We'll do this and a whole lot more when we continue right here on MidPoint.